Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another awesome virtual tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. I'm Vadim Perlovsky, and today we welcome back Sean Josephs with Pinhook Bourbon and Rye, which is my favorite side of that coin. We are, as always, joined by the Los Angeles Whiskey and Spirits Guild. Super happy to see all the members here. Thank you for joining us tonight. David Donahue's the president of the guild. David, do you want to say a couple of words?
Thank you very much, Vadim. I definitely would, particularly on this second iteration of a Pinhook virtual tasting with the Los Angeles Whiskey and Spirits Guild. And again, it is great seeing everybody. I asked the question before we started recording, how many people had or were here when we, in the very beginning, because I recall, Vadim, this was, several months after you started doing the virtual tastings that we had Sean on. Is that right?
I think it was July of 2020, August, somewhere around there.
So we had only been doing the virtual tastings for a few months, and at the time, I'm not, I have my favorites, and I knew my things, and I really didn't know anything about Pinhook. They were these odd bottles that people would see in Trader Joe's or in some sort of retailer, and they had this thing called a vertical series. I'm like, what's a vertical series? I didn't know anything about it, so I was very laissez-faire about the whole thing. So let me just share with everybody here that the experience that I had that night with Sean, and as he took us through his process and we tasted through the samplers, not only did it convert me to people that source product from various places, but how they batch it and put, I think it's, Sean, is called pods. Do you have little pods or things that you do? So, and as he did this for a couple hours, I was and am and will always remain a fan, convert, and a follower of all things Pinhook. I was not a fan of source product, and anybody kind of turns their nose at it. I go, have you never had Pinhook? They in my opinion, set the benchmark for doing some of the best work in the industry. So congratulations for doing what you're doing. This is going to be fantastic. I'm so excited that you're back, and I'm going to be quiet and say, let's enjoy tonight.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Sean, no pressure at all. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you, David.
It really was.
Welcome, everyone who's here, who's a regular. Welcome tonight. We're glad to see you. Anyone who's here for the first time, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Just a little bit of a housekeeping. This is a conversation. We're here to ask questions, get nerdy. Use the chat as much as you can. Post tasting notes, ask questions. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, but we just ask that you keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. So if you forget to mute yourself, I will help you with that, just because we don't want background noise and people talking over each other. But other than that, get nerdy, ask the serious questions. That's what we're all here for, and enjoy. And Sean, we're excited to have the co-founder of Pinhook on the tasting with us tonight. One of our very first questions, as you know, is always, what order are we going to taste in, and should we pre-pour the samples?
I think it's always a good idea to pre-pour. Air, it actually reminds me when I first got into bourbon, I was told that, because my background's in wine, that bourbon doesn't open up in the glass the way wine does. And I think that's actually untrue. I guess it's both true and untrue, right? It doesn't open up as quickly, like it doesn't respond to oxygen as quickly. But I think anyone who's really into bourbon and maybe has a bunch of bottles that they've opened, put the top back on and tasted over time, or even left a bourbon in their glass for an hour, understands that ultimately it does affect it. So first we should taste, this is our everyday bourbon, orange wax, bourbon heist, you would have it listed as, followed by our rye, which is the green wax, which is our everyday rye. And then we'd go to the two verticals in order of age, 4 and 5.
Okay.
And then finish it with the highest proof, which is cask strength at almost 120 proof.
Awesome. So we're going to jump around between bourbon and rye.
What was number 3?
I think that's, I'm sorry, David?
What was number 3?
Number 3 would be, I would go into the 4-year vertical for 3, the 5-year vertical for 4, and then the high proof for
And
5.
Vadim, can you tell us which ones? Because the labels don't say that.
Yeah, so you're gonna look at Tis Right Time 4-year, and then Tis Right Time 5-year, and then Bourbon War 5-year, and then Bourbon Heist high proof. I don't remember what I put on the bills, but we're gonna go up in proof essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah, essentially we're going up in proof, except the 4-year is a little bit lower than the flagship. But
So Bourbon Heist is
Yeah,
number
I
1.
think in that one, that's a little tricky because we're going between 2 different distilleries.
Mhm.
So I'd rather do it that way.
Makes sense.
Tis Rye Time is number 2.
No, a hard rye guy is number 2. So we're gonna do Bourbon Heist, hard rye guy, Tis Rye Time 4, Tis Rye Time 5, Bourbon War, and then Bourbon Heist. I'll toss all that in the chat. But while I type that up, Sean, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Pinhook and all that stuff?
I would love to. The wonderful introduction I got is reminding me of when I had my first job in New York after being a ski bum, I guess, in Telluride, Colorado. But it was my, I was like working in the kitchen and selling lift tickets. So it was a job, but I had my first real job in New York working at a design agency. And my boss told me, under promise, over deliver, which I really aim to do. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I got such a nice intro from Vadim and David. Maybe I've got to stretch even higher. That reminds me of I actually worked at a restaurant in New York called Per Se, which at the time was ranked as the 8th best restaurant in the world. And, I think our feeling every night was everyone is coming in expecting the best meal they've ever had. And the only possibility is to meet that or exceed that. I guess I welcome the pressure, but thank you guys so much. We had a great conversation. I guess it was a year ago, and it's so good to be back. I think the fun thing, and it really is at the heart of what makes Pinhook different, is we would be tasting completely different things than we tasted a year ago, because what makes us unique, and because of my background as a sommelier in the wine world, is I was intrigued by the idea of making vintages of bourbon. So even to this day, and certainly when I first got into bourbon in around like 2004, 2005, the bulk of the bourbon industry is based on the idea that there's a flavor profile, right? For Four Roses or Maker's Mark, et cetera, and a set proof for each expression, right? So when you buy Four Roses small batch, it's always going to be the same proof. When you get Four Roses single barrel, they always proof them the same. And so coming from a wine perspective, the idea, of course, is that you look at the harvest of that year and you make the best wine you can, right? And so again, having a wine perspective and then really getting into bourbon, when I set out on this journey of seeing if I could do something that would be interesting, at least to me, in the bourbon world, it wasn't, I think I can do something better, but it's more like, what's a different perspective, and a perspective that is made sense to me. And so that idea was, let's make vintages of bourbon. So every year, so each one of these, orange is our everyday bourbon. Green is our everyday rye. We'll talk about the vertical series kind of separately. Magenta is our high proof bourbon. Each one of those colors is always the same expression each year, but every year I make a new vintage. So I look at our mature barrels as our harvest, and I just set about to make the best blend that I possibly can. So there is no Pinhook flavor profile. There is no attempt to look for certain notes or certain flavors. There's only the idea of like, I'm going to make the most delicious whiskey that I possibly can, right? Now, I think it maybe in theory, it's easy to say, well, what if you don't have any parameters around a flavor profile, then what is that? what is delicious. Well, in wine, the focus is always around what we call deductive tasting, right? Which this is a bit of an oversimplification of it. And this is how I would kind of apply it to bourbon. You want complexity on the nose, right? That's that basic idea. Wow, every time I put my nose in the glass, I'm smelling something different. There's something intriguing that brings you back to it. That's exciting to you. You want the same thing on the palate, complexity. Wow, I was just tasting rosemary, and then all of a sudden, I swear I just tasted tart cherry, and there's something that keeps grabbing you and pulling you back in, pulling you back in. You want an overall intensity of flavor, but you're also looking for balance, which maybe is, I think, not super esoteric, right? But the idea that all of these flavors that you're getting are in balance with each other. It's not just, oh, it's a cinnamon bomb, or, oh, it all just tastes like eucalyptus. It's a number of different things that you're tasting, and they're in balance and harmony with each other. You're looking for a long and lingering finish, right? Even a bourbon, or I would say a wine that has all these great qualities, if it has a short finish, you can't consider it a great product. So you want a long and lingering finish. You're looking for great texture, probably something overlooked in both, I'd say, wine and whiskey, or even beer is, I think it's a comprehensive experience. So how does the whiskey sit on your palate? What is the weight of it? And we can talk about it more later, but to that end, all of our products are unfiltered. Filtering basically takes a lot of the oil out of the whiskey, and those oils carry color, flavor, and texture. And so that is what I'm looking for. So when I sit down and I blend our product, I don't have any specific idea of what it's supposed to taste like. I only know that those benchmarks of quality that I mentioned are the goal. And everything that happens in terms of how that particular whiskey tastes is, up to the bourbon gods, as it were, right? So, and it's really a process of seeking and just trying many different combinations of barrels together until I find something that really speaks to me. And the one thing I should mention, which I don't think probably most people don't think about much, because maybe they wouldn't even be aware this is the case. The way all the major distilleries work, they taste all of their whiskeys at 20% alcohol, which would be like 40 proof, because they're just looking for consistency of maturation. They're not drinking it like a consumer. They're not thinking about, how does this whiskey hit me, like all of us, I would say, and I include myself in that, who love whiskey. When you sit down and drink a whiskey, you drink it at whatever, it's 110 proof, 90 proof, cask strength, whatever it is. And you're enjoying it how it's meant to be enjoyed. When they're tasting the whiskey, they're simply trying to figure out, are the barrels on floor 3 of warehouse H maturing in the way that we expect? Because when they go to dump 1,000 barrels into a tank, so they can make, their weekly batch of Maker's Mark, so they can make 1 million cases of Maker's Mark a year, they need to make sure that everything is just kind of on point so that they can hit their profile. I do all of our blending at cask strength, because to me, I'm looking at it only from the perspective of a whiskey lover. I'm not looking for just like, are there flaws here? Is it consistent? I'm not interested in consistency. I just want to know if we've made a really good whiskey. And we can start with this guy. So this is our entry level, as I mentioned, Bourbon Heist.
Could I ask a favor? Because we have a few new folks.
Yeah.
Most of us here have our Glencairns.
Yeah.
And we have a set. Could you just kind of walk us through how you kind of approach the glass, how you nose
Sure.
it, how you mouth it, and just kind of take us through it. I would really enjoy that, please.
Absolutely.
Sean, before we do that,
Yes.
sorry, 2 interruptions in a row, but just
Yeah.
I think out of fun, the last time we did this tasting, it kind of blew my mind of my impressions of bourbon and rye in general. So I'm going to throw out a quick poll just to see where people sit before the tasting, and I want to see where people sit after. So if people generally prefer bourbon, or like if you had to choose one, which one would you choose? We all know Jane's going to go for the rye. We all know that one.
But I
in
can't be,
general,
I'm not objective. I'm, it's
You had to pick
Pinhook.
one. You had to pick one. I think it'll be interesting to just check how the answers correlate with the end of the tasting to see if anybody's palate is kind of, if their minds were opened today.
I still want to comment, but I'm not.
Awesome. I think just about everyone voted.
How do we do?
We're looking at our last couple of 30 people, 32.
All right,
Alright.
fill out the poll.
Yep.
Please.
Yeah, so we're looking at about 60% bourbon, 30% rye, or 40% rye. Sorry, I don't know how to add up to 100. 60
That's
40.
pretty good. Would anyone venture a guess? And this is nationally. Bourbon outsells rye, what to what? If you had to guess.
10-1.
80-20.
It's not as bad as you think. It's better than you think. It's 3-1.
3-1.
Yeah. And I mean, probably part of the reason it's even that is because so many bartenders love rye, and rye is such a important ingredient in so many classic cocktails. So I bet it skews the numbers. I don't actually know what the percentage is. What you would say is what in the business we call off premise, which would be retail, retail shops versus on premise, which would be restaurants. I bet the restaurants help skew it in favor of rye just because they push it into so many cocktails. And I think people that kind of geek out tend to end up with rye as their favorite. Not to lead anybody, but I would say tends to be where people go. But yeah, so to David's point, so yeah, how do I approach? So I guess I'm still stuck as a swirler from my wine days. I think people would more say you don't really swirl whiskey, you would more turn your glass to help bring out some of the aromas. It's much more intense, obviously, in alcohol than wine. So with wine, you would really try to swirl it and then stick your nose deep in the glass to try to pull out as much as you can. If you do that with a lot of bourbons, you're going to get that sharp burst of ethanol that feels like it might be singeing your nose hairs. So I'd say there are kind of two ways to approach smelling or nosing. One would be going from a distance, which is actually really helpful. I call it the Mariah Carey sort of when she's going for the high note, she's got to pull the mic away so she doesn't shatter our eardrums. And so try breathing through your nose, but keeping it and move it and try it at different distances. One thing I find is helpful, which is I would say the same as wine, is also you kind of tilt it to both sides, try different quadrants of the glass. Like it really helps to kind of move around and look for different things. And then the other tip that's helpful is to put your nose a little deeper in the glass, but actually part your lips and breathe in through your mouth, not your nose. And you'll find what that does is it's enough to get the olfactory going. So it'll pull enough that you can smell it, but you're not gonna, because you're not pulling directly through your nose, it makes it easier to get past the alcohol and smell some of the flavors some of the aromas that are lingering underneath. So now that we've, before we get to the palate part and just talking about how it tastes, does anyone have anything that jumps out to them about the nose of this whiskey?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Stephen was saying it noses like a rye.
I mean, one thing to me too is, and I'll just point out to people, this is our everyday bourbon. And I mean that in the best way possible. This is not meant to be our, like, I hope maybe it blows someone's mind. And if it does, great. But this is really meant to be our everyday sipper. Depending on where you see it, it could be a $37, $35, $33. It kind of depends on the store. It's 98 proof, which is important to me. A lot of entry level whiskeys are in the 80 to 86, maybe 90 proof range. But I think at 98 proof, it's got enough alcohol and or weight that it can stand up to ice. It can stand up to dilution in a cocktail. So, I would say by all means, make an old fashioned with it, make a Sazerac with it, make a Manhattan, etc. I like that last comment. It's like, yeah, it does take a minute for the nose to open up, right? And someone would say, first note I got was corn, which I think you would expect before it opens up. You are going to get some grain, especially this is a blend of 3 and 4-year-old barrels. And sorry, I should also mention this is, and David was talking about sourcing. There are actually 2 primary things for people that don't own distilleries. One is sourcing and one is contracting. So this is actually contract distilled. Sourcing is when you're buying excess capacity from a distillery and you're just buying what they have, right? So if Four Roses has a mash bill that's 35% rye, a bourbon that's 35% rye, and they were willing to sell me some, I don't get any say in what I'm buying. I'm just buying what they have available, and that's sourcing. Contract distilling is where you're specifying to a distillery what you want them to make. So this is actually contract distilled with Castle and Key, which is the former Old Taylor distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. So I got to work with their distilling team and specify a mash bill. The process was I sat down with them and I tasted different mash bills with different yeasts as white whiskey, right? Obviously there's no way to know what it's going to taste like when it's older. So you're really tasting it as a raw product. And I picked the mash bill that was the most appealing to me. So this is 75% corn, 15% rye, and 10% malted barley. But I like those notes and saying, yeah, first corn, kind of something dusty. And then the caramel starts to come out and also some nice florality, which I think is great. And maybe it's the floral note that you would associate with rye, because rye has a lot of florality. And it'll be really fun to taste the rye right after this and then see, by comparison, what that's like.
What was this last year, your flagship? Was that also
Same thing? And yeah, and the big difference between the two, besides the fact that it's obviously different barrels, is this year the average barrel age is significantly higher.
Okay.
And so keeping
dilly to me.
Yeah, and I think, look, dill, for anyone who likes wine, is a classic note on Rioja from Spain. And one thing that makes Rioja from Spain unique as a wine is it's aged in American oak. Most American whiskey is aged in American oak. This is aged in American oak barrels. Most of the wood comes from the Ozarks. And so dill would definitely be a classic American oak note. So let's check it out on the palate. So, look, for the palate, to me, it's 2 different things. If you're tasting to assess, then you would do what Kentucky takes credit for is the Kentucky chew, where you're really not swishing or gargling the whiskey, but actually chewing with your mouth closed. Otherwise, it's not going to go very well. Chewing the whiskey around, so it's truly coating your entire palate. And again, I think for the purposes, that's not how I would drink my whiskey. If I was just hanging out at home and hanging out with friends. But if you were really trying to say, let me see what this whiskey's all about, then you would go more for and you'll see when you do it that way, it's obviously way more intense than when you just take a sip. But the benefit is it's going to hit the front, middle, back of your palate. It's going to hit the sides, and you're going to truly get a sense of what the whiskey's all about. I love Brendan's comment, bright and fruit forward, for sure. Perfect sunny day drinker. I agree completely. And I think that's something that people maybe overlook with whiskey sometimes or bourbon is, I think this is, and it's really, to me, the benefit of younger whiskey is you're going to get more bright fruit. You're going to get citrus, and you're going to get an overall feeling of a kind of brightness and freshness that I think is super appealing. It doesn't all have to be leather, tobacco, spice, earth, and there's plenty of room for that too. It's all great, but I think one reason I'm an advocate for enjoying younger whiskey is because, one, I think it plays really nicely in cocktails. If you're going to make an old fashioned and add bitters and sugar to it, why would you take a bourbon that has been aged for 10 years or 8 years and probably already is like a cocktail in some ways? It's got so much spice and so much sweetness from the barrel, and then add more sugar and more spice to it. But you take something young like this and make a cocktail with it, and I think it's a great application. But it's also like great on a summer day, just on the rocks. I mean, so many great comments here. White Dog, yeah, White Dog is delicious in its own way. I think it takes some getting used to, and especially if you've only had whiskey that's been aged, you taste White Dog, and I don't know, maybe it would be a little reminiscent of grappa, or something that you've had that you'd be familiar with. But and thank you, Kate, for the comment. I get something different with each sip, and again, I think that's, I feel flattered to hear that, because that means it's showing some complexity, right? For something that honestly, I would say this represents the true entry to Pinhook.
Here's one of the sips I took, was really crazy. I tasted corn, definitely corn, that sweetness,
Yeah,
and then
sure.
and smoothness, and rye at the same time. So I got this sweet, smooth corn whiskey, and then I could taste the rye on top. It was like a layer, but they were together. It was, I don't know, it just kind of blew my mind. It's fun.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's the ultimate compliment, right? Because I mean, that's obviously the point of having a mash bill, where you're utilizing different grains and trying to get them to play well together. And I think what you described perfectly to me is the idea of integration. Like a really nice wine or whiskey is all of these flavors, but they're not kind of chopped up. They sort of intermingle with each other, and but then sort of are almost like toggling back and forth. You're like tasting one thing and you're tasting something else, and it's all kind of going together. But I think
Sean,
that would be
that's one of the things as we move on to the next one. Looks
Yeah.
like I've always kind of noticed with Pinhook's expressions that they do have that. They're not really. I've never had anything that's been harsh. I've had things that have been a little bit smoother and mellow than I would prefer.
Yep.
But most of them have that mouthfeel that's just ridiculous. And I always am an advocate, and there's several of us that are on here that have heard me say, you have to buy it. If you haven't tried it, just buy it. And I think that they hopefully are converts as well, too.
Thank you.
But we've done over 100 of these virtual tastings. And
Wow.
I would say that I have lost count on the expressions, because we imagine 5 to 6 samples per virtual tasting, and we've done over 100. It is, I cannot remember or recall a brand that has had the level of complexities, nuance, subtleties that Pinhook kind of continuously provides on a regular basis. So you're in my top 10 of all of them.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I would like to think, to a couple points that you made, that I think maybe the most underrepresented aspect of whiskey production is filtration. So, and let me just briefly explain what I mean by filtration. So, chill filtration is the most common way of filtering. The reason that filtration exists is because if you bottle a low proof whiskey, like let's say 80 to 90, maybe even 95 proof, and you don't filter it, which is strip out some of the oils, then you'll get what's called flocking, where the whiskey will become cloudy. It could happen while it's just sitting on the shelf, or it could happen when you pour it over ice and all of a sudden the whiskey in your glass looks cloudy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like, it doesn't affect the quality. But from the consumer perspective, people are used to a clear whiskey, right? So that was always the practice. And before bourbon became really popular, which I would say in recent years was like 2011, 2012, a lot of stuff that was bottled at low proof. And so chill filtration was just the way things were done. There's another type of filtration called carbon filtering, which is adding basically activated charcoal into the tank. And it basically looks like they're adding black flour into the tank. The oils, so sorry, chill filtration is kind of like what it would sound like. You have a tank full of whiskey, they drop the temperature really low. That causes those oils to precipitate and fall to the bottom. And then they're able to separate the filtered whiskey from basically the sediment on the bottom. The other way to do it is carbon filtration. So they're adding carbon into the tank, and then they pass it through a paper filter, and the oils adhere themselves to the charcoal, and then you pass it through. It's a way of doing the filtration that's less kind of intrusive or invasive, so you strip less out of it. But I would say with chill filtration, you're stripping 30% of the flavor and the texture and also the color. I mean, the color doesn't really matter, but like that's how much you're just pulling out. Everything we're tasting tonight is unfiltered. And what unfiltered means is we did use what's called a micron filter. So it's really just a screen, but the screen is just removing sediment. It's not removing any of the oils. So you're really getting a pretty true representation of the whiskey. So I think that's one thing.
From the barrel.
Yeah, you're just getting the char out of the barrel, exactly. And there's the chunks, and then there's also the more, the finer sediment. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think basically any brand, no matter what else they did, if they offered an unfiltered product 100% of the time, you'd get a better whiskey. Period. And then I think to your other point, David, is, and I genuinely don't mean this as a criticism of the way that people approach it. It's simply saying they picked their flavor profile and now they're married to it, and they just have to repeat it over and over again. Sometimes I might make something better, and sometimes maybe, or it probably depends on the person's palate when I make a new vintage, but I have no restrictions. I'm trying to make, to all the points that you made, David, I'm trying to make the most complex, the most balanced, the most harmonious, the most complex whiskey that I possibly can. Maybe sometimes I do better than others, but I'm doing the best I can. But I think it gives me the best chance every time at getting the most out of those barrels, because everyone else for the most part has built a box for themselves, and now they're trying to blend into the box. And so for us,
and they're trying to get out of it by adding some, different finishes. I mean,
there's that too.
Really impressed. Yeah. Not impressed, but I'm happy that some of the bigger brands are kind of venturing out, because we had them on virtual tastings, and so they're trying to get out of their box.
Yeah, and I think that's what's fun. Yeah, I'm sure since you guys have sat in on so many of these, what you've started to see, which is kind of cool, and it's obviously very typical. You have Beam Suntory, which is worth $17 billion or whatever it is, and they do what they do, but it's going to be the small guys that are likely to innovate and are not afraid to try things because they have nothing to lose. And I think the good news is they do have an influence on the big guys, and hopefully that's good, most importantly for the consumer, right? Because then the big guys are like, oh, everyone thinks it's cool that these other guys are doing, maybe we should be doing this. And frankly, those big guys, the one thing they have in spades is massive quantities of amazing whiskey. So when they set their minds to trying to do cool stuff with it, I think that's good for everybody that likes bourbon, 100%. So let's get into this rye. I think this will be fun, especially because there was a comment that there was something in the bourbon that reminded them of rye. So let's see how different they are from each other. I should point out that this is a really unusual mash bill. The bourbon mash bill that I selected is what I would call a traditional mash bill, maybe a little bit higher in the barley and a little bit higher in the rye. But if you look at the industry as a whole, the sort of 70 to 75% corn and somewhat equal parts rye and malted barley, I consider that to be incredibly traditional. This is about as atypical as you would get. 60% rye, 20% barley, and 20% corn. It's not atypical for the rye percentage. It's atypical for the barley percentage. Barley is typically would maybe be 5%. And I wish I could say I had some like amazing foresight or like master plan. I just happened to be sitting down in a room in Kentucky. Actually, I would have been sitting in the room like right over David's left shoulder there. Right, exactly. You know, working, tasting different options. And there was just something about this mash bill that I thought was incredibly complex. And I'm really happy. I feel like it's over time. I can't say I could have predicted where it was going to go. But I think barley has a very nutty, kind of savory component, which balances nicely with these typical kind of herbaceous rye notes. Yeah, go ahead, David. Sorry.
Is this particular expression contracted or a blend of contracted and sourced?
This is 100% our Castle and Key or Old Taylor distillery contracted as well. Yep.
Every time Jane says dill or pickles, I get dill and pickles.
The power of suggestion is, but you know, one thing that I think is really important with tasting and tasting notes is I think some people, for whatever reason, it just resonates as something specific. But maybe the one thing that we could all agree is there's something herbaceous, right? And that could be dill, or it could be mint, or it could be eucalyptus. You know, it could come across in many different ways.
I think it's interesting. Before you mentioned the mash bill, I was tasting this and going, wow, you know, I taste the rye, you know, but I was like, it almost tastes a little scotchy to me, you know, and I was trying to figure out
Absolutely.
why, but then you said 40% or whatever it was.
20% barley, but yeah, that would be.
Which is relatively high, I think, for a lot of American whiskeys. So anyway, it's really interesting. I like it.
Thank you. Looking at all the notes, I would just say this is getting high marks for complexity because people are covering the gamut from clover, honey, mint. So we're getting the mint and the dill, which is the herbaceous side, something grassy, which again, that would still fall on the herbaceous side. Mint, menthol, again, all of those things are in that range. And this is a blend of also 3 to 4 year old rye. So on the younger side of rye, and we're going to get to taste some older rye as well, although from a different mash bill. So we'll see where it goes.
Is your flagship getting older every year?
It did from last year, but I think it might be, I would never say something like, and this is where it stops. But I think for now, I mean, in a perfect world, I would love to get both to 4 years. But, you know, for anyone who understands this business, it's not easy to do because it's, you know, the age statement is the youngest whiskey in the blend. And so if I blended 149 4-year-old barrels with 1 3-year-old barrel, it would have to carry a 3-year-old age statement. That's how the rules work. Green apples and cherries. Yeah, I like that. I do think there's some dark fruit on this one as well. And again, same thing. So this is in the industry, we would say line priced. So you might see retailers charge differently for it, but we charge the same for it. So the bourbon and the rye are meant to have the exact same price. So again, this is the, you know, the counterpart to the orange wax in terms of being our everyday rye. Great for a Manhattan, great for a Sazerac.
The rye is green.
The rye is green, yeah.
Yeah.
Great for a Sazerac. I like rye and old fashioned. I mean, really, you can. I mean, I think bourbon and rye are kind of interchangeable in a lot of cocktails. It's just fun to play around with both. But I do think it's funny looking at everyone's notes, and I guess I'm going to reveal my bias. I think rye is more complex than bourbon, period. Whether I think it's like also saying like I think Pinot Noir is more complex than Cabernet Sauvignon. It's up to the individual. That's not saying it's better. Like you don't have to value the complexity because Cabernet Sauvignon is a great grape and it's capable of producing great wine, obviously, and corn or bourbon is capable of being an incredible spirit. But I just think all you have to do, if anyone wants to look back, look at all the notes, and we got some nice notes on the bourbon, but the range of notes for the rye. And I just think that, rye is a lot more complex. And I think that's why people maybe come around to rye in the long run, is because I think the more that you drink American whiskey, and David was kind of alluding to it with brands trying different things, the more you're like, okay, that's cool. I enjoy that. But now I'm excited to try other things and to keep expanding my palate. And I think rye is that thing.
Yeah, one of the things that Rise did, Sean, for me, particularly, Pinhook, is that the noses on a rye to me are much more complex and much more enjoyable and perfume-like.
Oh yeah.
Than almost anything else. And so that's what's really always kind of drawn me to, a really good rye, is just how well it noses. And then especially if it's going to be non-chill filtered, the mouthfeel, and then the finish. And it's just one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question, Sean?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I've always kind of felt like ryes are very hit or miss for me, in the aspect of a great rye is absolutely incredible.
Yep.
And then if I'll taste another rye, it's just so one note or this. So when you say that a rye to you is much more complex, what is it about, without naming names of different brands and all that kind of stuff, like what is it that can make one rye, when it hits, so great, and other ryes just kind of leave you wanting more? Like, is it in the mash bill, or where is that?
It's such a good question. I think that it's because rye is blended to a style, and because based on the idea that rye is supposed to be a certain thing, and that certain thing is like a punch in the face. Like that's what rye is. It's spicy and it hits you up front, and it's like it's just it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like that's the idea of what rye is supposed to be. And so then when everybody blends rye, they go into it saying like, well, this is our rye, so this is what people are expecting. And so it's just like it just keeps going and going and going. But I think that's really one of the fun things that I learned from blending, was maybe I had my own preconceived notions, but then when I sat down to blend and we have our blending process, I was just taking the same approach with the rye as I took with the bourbon, which is like, I'm looking for complexity, I'm looking for balance. And then I found that kind of underneath it all is like David mentioned, way more in rye than you get in bourbon: florality, the herbaceousness, which maybe that's the thing you get even in those aggressively spiced ryes. But there's fruit, florality, obviously all the great spice you're getting from the barrel. And I really do think it's because I think if you just try to blend rye to make a great whiskey, it'll show in a way different way. If you blend rye to say, I need to hit an expectation of what rye is meant to be and like what people expect out of rye, that's where you get the one. And that's why I think you're having those two kind of disparate experiences. And then throw into the mix that like, if that rye is also, I mean, I think we've reached a point, and I feel comfortable saying this because I don't think I'm picking on anyone in particular. Like, I don't really think any whiskey wants to be 80 proof. Like 80 proof is the lowest proof at which you can legally bottle, American whiskey. And I think it's a pretty poor representation. If you were to go into a rick house and drill a hole in the barrel, which is how it's done, they take a drill and they go bzzz, and then a beautiful stream comes out of the barrel and you catch it and you taste what that whiskey is. A chill filtered 80 proof whiskey is so removed from what that is. It's not even funny. And so that would be the other thing. I think you're tasting ryes that are not only blended to the style of this like spice and this like kind of one note thing, but then they've also like taken the proof way down and they filtered the crap out of it. And what's left is not anything that is particularly special. Yeah, someone said unless it's dusty 80 proof. Yeah, they had a magic back then, and part of that was because the entry proofs were much lower, right? I think for anyone who doesn't know, not to get too nerdy, but the highest proof at which you can enter the barrel is 125. Most people enter the barrel at 125 because that's maximum yield, right? It's the same amount of volume, but obviously if you proof down later and add water, which pretty much everyone's doing, the higher the proof is, the more volume you can create from the 53-gallon barrel. I think Wild Turkey notoriously likes to go in quite low. We go in at 120, but you know, you can go in as low as you like, and they used to go in quite low. And the idea of that is like, because you have less astringency with the alcohol, you're getting a much nicer kind of softer interaction between the wood and the alcohol because you don't have as much heat. And that leads to a much more deeply flavored whiskey, so that you could have, as someone, Nick pointed out, a dusty 80 proof whiskey that probably went in at like a super low proof and managed to maintain a lot of its integrity, you know, even when water was added to it.
Yeah, and we do, we may not remember, but we are the Geek Society too. So if you want to go down any particular rabbit hole, we'll be happy to.
We'll geek out.
No apologies. Yeah, no, we love it.
All right, let's jump on to the next one. What do we have? Tis 4-year? Is that what we're up to?
Yeah, tis 4-year, tis right time 4-year. Took a bit of searching to get both of these in the lineup, but I'm excited.
Oh man, I'm excited about this too. I'm going to be honest and say that I drank all mine and I can't find a bottle, so I can't taste along with you, but I know this whiskey quite well, and I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say about it, because it's got a lot going on. So this is a 4-year-old MGP rye. This is their, actually, I shouldn't say this as a fact because maybe I'm missing something, but as far as I know, it's the only rye they make at MGP. It's 95% rye, 5% malted barley. I feel like in a way it's become the most famous rye in the world, not Pinhook rye, but MGP rye, because for anyone who's not familiar, whether you're drinking, you know, High West or Templeton or Bullet, just for starters, or Willet rye back in the day, and the list is pretty long, you were drinking most likely this rye. But I'm really proud of this particular bottling and the whole idea of, and I don't need to do like a whole Pinhook spiel, but what I'll say about this is when we got our contract with Castle and Key, that was entirely unexpected, right? I just thought we were going to be sourcing. I never thought we'd have a contract with a Kentucky distillery. It was friends of ours that bought the distillery. And so we were the first people they approached. They knew they needed to have contracts in order to have a financially viable model. And so we had all these MGP barrels that we had purchased because, as far as we knew, we were going to just keep, you know, buying from MGP and, you know, hopefully sourcing from other places and doing all that kind of stuff. And I felt like I was in a bit of a conundrum, because my thought was, all right, well, we have our Castle and Key product, which we ultimately want to make like the core of what we do, like our Kentucky. And look, by the way, of course you can make great whiskey anywhere, but when I got into bourbon, and 95% of bourbon, American whiskey, is still made in Kentucky, to me it was all about Kentucky. So like I was so excited. And so we had these rye barrels, and as well as bourbon barrels from MGP. And I was trying to think of something unique that we could do with them that would also like keep it very distinct and separate from our Castle and Key stuff. And so, as I mentioned, I have a wine background, and, you know, in wine, there's this idea of a vertical of wine where, you know, you go into a restaurant, you look at the list and they have every vintage of a particular producer, let's say between 1990 and 2000. And you can, not maybe in a single night, but you can taste the vintage variation in each. But what you're also tasting is the fact that once a wine is bottled, it continues to really age in the bottle. As we discussed in the beginning, you know, bourbon isn't really doing that not really aging in the bottle. It might open up in the glass, but in the bottle, not much is happening. Where all the magic happens, of course, in bourbon is in the barrel. So my idea with the vertical series, it just happened that all the barrels of rye that we had and all the barrels of bourbon were all from a single lot of each, meaning all the bourbon barrels we had were filled within 2 months of each other. So essentially they're all the same age, and same with the rye. And my thought was, wouldn't it be fun to follow these barrels as they age? So we bought them when they were around 1 year old. And this is the first release of the Rye Vertical series. And the idea of the Rye Vertical series is to follow these barrels as they age from 4 to 12 years old. So this is a 9-year series. And every year you'll have the opportunity to buy the new vintage, and the new vintage, again, you have a lot of variation in the barrels themselves, but it's the same lot of barrels. And the primary variable is that they're 1 year older. I just want to explain really quickly, because I think this is the part that confuses people sometimes, is they think it's not a Solera. We're not taking little bits out of all the barrels, right? Think about it more like this way. There are 450 barrels of rye. I take 50 of them, I do a blend, I leave the remaining 400 behind. They age for a year. Now I have 400 5-year-old barrels. I take 50 of those, I blend them, I leave the remaining barrels behind to age for a year. Now they're 6 years. I take 50 barrels, and so on and so forth. So that's how it works. I'm taking 100% of the barrels that we take for a blend, and all the rest are being left to age further. And so the final vintage of our bourbon vertical series will be a 12-year-old bourbon in 2027 and a 12-year-old rye in 2028.
I really hope you're not leaving 50 barrels for 8 years from now, because there's going to be nothing left with certain someone tasting every year, and the angels as well.
So actually you bring up a good point. So the way that we're doing it, does anyone know the average rate of evaporation per year?
It depends on where.
Yeah, it depends
In
on
Kentucky.
Virginia.
Well, it
will
depends
have,
where in
like,
Kentucky.
We'll add it, but it's
Yeah, I think
Like
Virginia
4
would
to
be
5, right?
4 to 5, exactly. So you get 4 to 5% evaporation.
And does that taper off with age? I think I know in Scotland it goes down.
probably increase because of more volume.
I mean, we'll see what happens. I've always just heard that as an annual average. Like year one, you lose 10 to 14% because it's not just evaporation. You're just losing whiskey into the barrel that you'll never get back because it's absorbed into the pores. And if anyone's familiar with Jim Beam Devil's Cut, right, the idea was they steam the whiskey that's locked into the pores out of the barrel, so the staves are soaked. But the other factor for us is what I have found, at least to date, is that as you get more influence of wood, so you're getting tannin and spice and all these types of things, you need more proof, because the proof drives up the other flavors in the whiskey, the fruit primarily, and the grain, and all the things that are going to counterbalance the increased wood tannin from the barrel. And so with the bourbon vertical series, we're just about to release the 6-year-old, the third year in the series. The 4-year-old was 98 proof, the 5-year-old was 104 proof, and the 6-year-old is 107 proof. This is a 98 proof rye. The next year it went to 103. So we're losing a lot, not just because of evaporation, but because I'm increasing the proofs to make what I think is the best whiskey that we can. So what we're doing, to Vadim's point, is we have to, and again, it's a guess, but every year we have to increase the number of barrels we're dumping in order to try to, at least to some degree, have equal production.
Sean, one of the things that I enjoyed so much is, and I think that you guys are kind of getting to transition out of this particular sort of process is you were, I think, in your office at the time when you were doing our first virtual tasting, and you had the little pods. And I'm
Yes.
saying that correct, right?
Yeah.
So this is one thing that kind of really enchanted me and kind of enamored me to, to kind of the artistry of blending and having to kind of find that thing, find the balance between all of it and then kind of get it out to market.
Yeah.
You were, and am I correct in saying Pinhook kind of got their reputation by sourcing from various people like MGP?
Yeah.
And then you had to sit there with these samples of various barrels and just kind of blend them together to figure out how you were going to make that particular expression.
Exactly. So if you think about going back to what we were talking about before, if you're blending to a profile, it's still a ton of work, right? There's no question about it. But the work is trying to figure out the right barrels to put together so people can't tell the difference from one blend to the next. If you're just trying to make the most interesting whiskey you can and you don't care what the profile is, then the approach would be, and I think this is the easiest way to explain it, is let's say I'm going to do 100-barrel blend of our bourbon, right? And I can't just randomly pull 100 barrels because then I would just be randomly dumping 100 barrels together and maybe I'd get lucky and it would taste pretty good, but I'm not creating anything. So I would say on average, I would take 30% more barrels than we need. So instead of pulling 100 barrels, I'm pulling 130 barrels to do a 100-barrel blend. If I wanted to try, and so, sorry, so just to kind of like set the stage or set the scene as it were, that means, and I was talking about drilling a hole in the barrel. Someone at the distillery had to go into 130 barrels and drill a hole in each one. And then they put like a little wood spike in each one and hammer it back in. So they're literally going around, they have to drill holes and fill 200 milliliter bottles. So I'm sitting at a table and in front of me are 130 individual single barrel samples, right? And I need to do a blend. Well, if I tried to take, in order to do a 100-barrel blend, I would literally have to take equal parts of 100 barrels and sit there with the pipette and 100 times go soup, soup, right? Which would be, it would literally take months, like to try to work on a blend. So what David was talking about is creating pods where I'm taking equal parts of 10 barrels, which generally would be based on age because I have a variety of ages and it's a good way to group them by age. And if I take equal parts of 10 barrels and I put them in a new tiny bottle, now instead of 130 samples, I've whittled it to 13 samples, 13 10-barrel samples. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So now, in order to create a 100-barrel blend, I just need 10 of my 13. But if you have 13 and you only need 10, it still gives you almost 400 different possible combinations of 10, right? So there's still endless variety. I'd say on average, I would do 6 to 8 because by the time I get to that point, first I've tasted each individual pod, right? And kind of assessed each pod. And then I've started tasting all the combinations. So, by the time that happens, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of like where these barrels are and how good it can be. And I feel like, some of the pods are going to maybe blow your mind, right? Like one individual pod. And keep in mind, there's a randomness to those pods, but somehow the way those 10 came together, you're like, oh my God, that's phenomenal whiskey. And so you kind of have a benchmark for like, well, I need to be striving for that or better. And then you just keep playing around with these combinations. And again, having tasted through all 13, you have a pretty good understanding of the character of those barrels and what they're capable of. The part that I've found fascinating, though, is it's not as simple as saying, let me put the best ones together. I've often found that there's one pod that I really don't like, and somehow I can't make a good blend without it. And I'm not even sure that I can tell you why, because I think the sort of alchemy of what happens when you take these little 10-barrel pods and essentially put equal parts of 100 barrels in another little bottle and shake them all together. There are things happening that are, I think, beyond our ability to smell and taste, or at least predict how it's going to smell and taste. And then so I would say it's constantly a process of being surprised too. And the last thing I'll say related to that too is I think everyone talks about blending, but I think of it more as like a seeking or searching process. I'm just sitting there like the way I would imagine you all saying like, well, let's keep going until there's one combination where you're like, that's a good bourbon. That's really, really, really good. And you're satisfied and you feel that feeling that we all know when we take a sip of a great whiskey. The part that's challenging is I do all of that at cask strength. Because again, I don't really think that I can assess that at a low proof. And so even when we're blending our everyday product that would get proof somewhere between 95 and 100, I'll still do the blend at cask strength. Then we whittle it down to the 2 blends that we like the most, and then we'll proof those, let's say between 95 and 101, both of them, taste both of them at all the different proofs, and then you just see where the best whiskey comes out. If I'm doing a high proof expression, we'll proof it basically like 4 or 5 points below cask strength. And it really depends. I actually just finished up not too long ago blending our high proof rye that's coming out in the middle of October, which will also with our Castle and Key distillate, and cask strength was 123.8. And so we proofed it to 118, 119, 120, 121, 122, and 120. And we had cask strength at 123.8. So we had 6 different proofs. I invited 2 friends of mine that I really respect to join me. And then we just sat there and everyone was like, I don't know, there's something about this one. We went back and forth. We narrowed it down to the 3 that we liked the best, the 3 different proofs. And then we blinded them. And the interesting thing about that was I think everyone had different favorites, but then we all agreed on which the best one, and we didn't know which one we were talking about. Everyone was like, it's number 2. That's the one. And we were like, it's not even close. That was the funny part about it. So I think at some point that's the value of blind tasting, is you kind of got to get out of you end up developing a bias for some reason. Like you're just like, I don't know. I keep coming back to 119, but 123, that's the one. And then you put it in a blind and all bets are off. And that makes it a lot of fun.
Sean, thank you for that, because that's you shared what I remembered, how your process was, which really kind of, again, enamored me to the work that you have been able to, that Pinhook has been able to allow you to do, to bring this kind of product out to all of us so that we can kind of enjoy, the different expressions. So it's exciting to kind of hear you go through it again in your process, because it's amazing work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And it's always fun to talk about, because again, it's really, I think in the end, it's like, there's so much good whiskey out there, and certainly all the big guys make good whiskey. And I think in the end, part of it is almost like you get attached to the idea of like the approach and the philosophy, and just the way we think about it is, like I said, thinking about it from the consumer perspective. And it just keeps it fun for me. It's like, I was in the restaurant business for a long time, and I was explaining this to someone the other day. If I was a chef and you told me, here's how it's going to work. You need to pick your 6 favorite dishes, and now you just need to cook them over and over for the rest of your life. You're going to spend the next 30 years, and I don't care what excites you or what inspires you. You just need to cook them over and over and over again. I just couldn't do it. And so more than anything, and maybe this is the selfish part of the reason I do this is because I get excited. And that's what the vertical series is. Like when I go into blend the vertical series, I haven't really tasted the barrels for a year. So I feel like I'm as excited as any of you would be, right? To be like, oh, I can't wait to see how the 7-year-old barrels are tasting. Like, let's do this. This is going to be incredible. Not just like, oh, it's time to make the sausage again,
How long does that process take from beginning to end when you start that blending process?
It depends. I mean, it depends on the size of the blend, but I've gotten pretty efficient at it, because one is like, part of it is just the sheer mechanical part. So if you don't include the building of the pods, which again is just, it's not that common, but you're like equal parts, it's just like that type of thing. And then it's best, I've found, generally to break it up into a couple days. It's not always like, sometimes it's consecutive, sometimes it's not. Like when I proofed the rye, I actually hadn't tasted it in a while. I did the blending a month before, a month and a half before, and then the proofing was a completely separate exercise. And so the different part about the proofing too is when we do the blending from the pods, it's what we'd call a composite blend. So we're just blending from samples, but the barrels haven't been dumped. But then when I was doing the proofing that we were describing, that was happening from the whiskey where they had taken the 40 barrels and actually dumped them into the tank. Right. So it happened separately, but the actual process really could maybe take a few hours. Because I think at this point, like, I'm also, and I mean this in the best way, I'm just not super sentimental. And I'm just, I've done it enough times that I don't like that part. I would have to be honest and say I'm not doing like a consumer. Like if I have to assess 13 pods, I find it's almost more helpful to be reactive to what I'm tasting, not sit there and like savor it like I'm hanging out on the porch with my friends. Like I'm just kind of like, okay, this one's a little hot on the nose. Okay, got it. Fruitier on the palate than I might have thought. Okay. Oh wow, that's a super long finish. Great mouthfeel, blah, blah, blah. And I've got my notes and I'm like, boom, on to the next one. Like I'll just kind of fly through the assessment because I also know I'm just trying to quickly gauge the range. And then the second part where you're actually trying to blend, I think it just varies because sometimes you just more quickly get to something where this is the other area where I try not to mess with success, is like if I taste a blend and I'm like, that's phenomenal, I almost don't want to get into my own head and then be like, okay, like I try to go with almost more of a gut reaction and say like, how could you beat that? Like, that's amazing. Sometimes it can be like paralysis by analysis. Like you keep going. Like I said, there are 400 there are 400 possibilities. If you kept going and going and going, I think at some point you'd lose track of like, well, how much better was, let's say you call them A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, right? And those are your 8 blends. Like at some point you're like, I don't know, B and H are my favorite. And you're kind of, but let's reconsider this one. What if you doubled that and then tripled it? I think you would get lost.
Not to be pessimistic or jinx you or
Let's do it.
bring you a are you a little afraid that at the end you're just going to be like the leftover? I mean, using your 50 barrel analogy, like, oh, cool.
Yep.
Last one is the 50 duds. Like, you know what I mean? Like, are you a little afraid that like the end one is just going to be just like the ones you?
Oh, it's a good point. That's a great question. So I haven't had to get there yet, but I think that I have to blend the last 2 at the same time. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. So it's not just like the leftovers that were like,
Oh no, it can't be random. 100%. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think when I get to 11 and 12, I basically have to blend, like I have to sit there with all the barrels and work out 2 great blends. My experience would tell me that of course it's going to change, but if you found a great barrel combination, it's not going to become bad over the next year. And then I have the proof to mess around with too, which would give me some wiggle room. That's a great question.
So Sean, I've seen a couple retailers release like single barrels of the vertical series, at least the Rise.
Yeah.
Is there a particular process that you go through to decide like what barrels you want to make available to those retailers and kind of which ones you want to keep to put in the blend?
Yeah. So what I used to do, I changed the process. So what I used to do was only put barrels in the mix that I thought were good enough to be single barrels. And I find that the hit rate would be like 25 to 30 out of 100. Right. So if I tasted 100 barrels, I'd say 25 to 30 of them I think would be good enough to be a single barrel. Does that make sense? Like I would say like those 25 out of 30, if you just put those barrels on their own, they have enough good qualities that if you just bottle the barrel by itself, like I can stand behind that. That said, I think your really high quality range within that is maybe 8 to 10 of 100. If you're talking about the top, what I ended up realizing was like, I had to put a little more trust in the people that pick. And so I give people a range. So now what I do is I basically grade the barrels like they're kids in a class. I really do. Like, I don't know how else to think about it. I'm like, that's an A, that's an A plus, that's an A minus, that's a C, that's a C plus, that's a B minus, whatever. And then I give people a fair range. And the first year I tried it, I was like, this could be a really, really bad idea. I would say the percentage that people pick the best barrel that they are given is incredibly high. And if people don't pick what I had as the best barrel, I'm also open to the idea of like subjectivity, and that maybe I'd tasted too many barrels on that day and maybe my game was a little off, but like, that's how I approach it. So the question was, what do you do with less desirable barrels? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the whole purpose of blending. And I do get asked this question a lot. And there's like, sometimes you'll encounter a really weird barrel. Like there could be something musty about it or just something particularly bizarre. As long as a blend is big enough, it could possibly add character to it, or also possibly just disappear, right? If you're doing a 150 barrel blend, one barrel, no matter how weird it is a pretty small percentage. And then some barrels you come across are just like super green and super hot. But like I was saying, weirdly, when I do the blending, sometimes not in a way that I could necessarily predict, they end up having value. But I've never come across a barrel where you're just like, we need to take this barrel and bury it deep in the woods. It should never see the light of day. Like there's, it always can find a way. And who knows what another, year of age, because the barrels that don't get used, like I was saying in that example, if I blend 100 barrels and 30 barrels go back, I actually didn't taste those barrels individually. So that was just by chance. They weren't like the reject barrels. They just happened to end up in the pods that didn't get included. So I don't even know what those barrels taste like. So the barrels that were selected, the 100 that were selected, we tell the distillery whenever the date of production is, you need to dump these 100 barrels, and everything else just continues to age.
So I had a question. What was my question? I was thinking about it for like 10 minutes. When you're pulling pods and you're tasting them, have you ever run across where you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. I don't want to change this at all. I want to bottle this as it is. Like, any chance of a small batch coming at some point, essentially?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So for that very reason, I sort of got in my head, like, if you're doing 100 barrel blend and each pod represents 10%, that's still obviously very significant in terms of being a percentage of the blend. So it's like, you pull it out, you put it back in, like it makes a difference. But when you obviously work a lot smaller, right, then each barrel has more impact. So we did, and there was one, do you guys know Mission? So we did for the entire country, we did 10 what we called true small batch blends, which were 3 barrel blends. And the one that I shouldn't say 4, because they were involved in the blending process with Mission, was awesome. And I don't know, they might still have some on the shelf there. And so it's this bottle, but it's not this exact one. The one that they have has a gold small batch little medallion on the front. And what we did was, and it's so fun, it's basically like a miniature version of what I just described. So instead of having pods, you just have 6 single barrels and you're doing a 3 barrel blend. So that gives you 20 possible combos. Oh, there we go. Look. Of course. I love that. That's amazing.
Leave it to Jordan to pull it out.
So that's such a cool process, because obviously then each barrel is 33% of the blend, and it's really fun. I had the most fun time at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, and I did a blending seminar. And what we did was something similar. We sat down with it was very simple and people really got into it, but it was like, here are 5 single barrels, taste through each single barrel, take your deductive tasting notes on each one, get the characteristics of each one. And then it was like, I think there were 25 people in the seminar. And then it was just kind of like, all right, show of hands, like, what should we try first? And someone's like, oh, let's do 1, 3, 5. And everyone's like, yeah, that sounds great. All right, let's try 1, 3. And then everyone's like, nah, that's no good. Okay, what are we doing next? All right, let's try 2, 3, 5. And we try that. What do you guys think? It's better, but it's not great. Okay, what do we do next? And it was just, you've got so many possible combinations. And we call it true small batch because, there's no actual rule around what constitutes a small batch. Like, you can blend 1,000 barrels together and call it a small batch. So I figure if you only blend like 3 barrels, 10 barrels, or even 20 barrels, that's got to actually be a small batch. So like I said, we only did 10, and the one for Mission was the only one in California. So
That one's bourbon, and your rye is so much better. No offense.
maybe, you know what? Maybe we got to get the true small batch rye going for sure.
Why
So
why is it? It seems like you guys named yourself Pinhook Bourbon, and I mean, not to get very straightforward, but is it because bourbon's just such a hot item right now? Because
yeah,
prefer your rye a lot more.
yeah. I mean, we only started with bourbon.
Okay.
So when I founded the company with 2 friends of mine in 2010. We started by buying 20 barrels of bourbon from MGP. We paid, I think I mentioned this last time, but I always like saying it because that still makes me laugh. We paid $465 a barrel for 3-year-old bourbon back in 2011. So I do always like to point out to people that we started this company with $9,000, and then the storage cost was $1 per barrel. $1 a barrel per year, I think, at the time, right? So it was like, I mean, now it's a lot more than that, but basically it was like $240 a year, and then the $9,000, and that's how we got the company started. And then it was 3 years. So we did our first release of a 6-year-old bourbon in 2014. What are we tasting next? We have the 5-year.
Oh yeah, I'm on the 5-year. Yeah.
Is it?
What do you guys think?
Isn't this a small batch rye though?
That's funny.
Why is
So
Jordan flexing his Pinhooks?
his
score
flex
right
is pretty amazing. He's got it all.
We haven't got to the point of the evening where I want to talk about the collaboration series that was featured on their Facebook pages, only offered in a couple states.
Yeah, that was a tough one. And
Jordan ordered these via text message. He doesn't even leave his house. He's like, Pinhook, bring it to me, and it arrives.
That is a true statement, sir.
Yeah, we can talk about that during the promotional part of the program. Yeah, so that was, we called that one Accidental Marriage, and it is actually funny because it really, I had to laugh. That the one that I was inspired by all the fake sounding stories in bourbon, but I had to laugh because we had an account in California and an account in Kentucky, and they'd each picked a single barrel of rye. And the way it works at the distillery, they have a single barrel dumping tank that is split. So it has, there's essentially a wall that separates them, but it's also set up so that you can blend more barrels together, like 3 barrels together. So the way it's set up is like you dump a barrel into one side, you dump a barrel on the other side, and it allows you to like move along with the bottling process. Well, someone literally, I know it sounds fake, which is what I love about it, but they literally hit the like, do not press this button. And they married the barrels on accident. And they called, and Castle and Key called us apologizing profusely for obvious reasons. And our biggest concern was honestly the 2 accounts, because now we couldn't deliver their single barrels to them. And so we're like, we're so sorry, we have to send you new samples. They were super understanding, which was great. And then we were like, what are we supposed to do with this? And right away I was like, well, it had already been bottled with no labels. And I was like, well, send it to me, let's see what happens. And it just happened to be, which again, as we discussed, it's like, yeah, you could randomly blend 2 barrels together and it could be phenomenal, or you could blend 2 barrels together and it could be okay, or it could be terrible. And this just happened to be phenomenal. And I was like, this is amazing. And it really is one of those cases where a mistake led to an idea. And then we're like, well, what do we call this thing? Oh, we should call it accidental marriage. My founding partner, Charles, does all of our design. Like, he designs our bottles and all of our website and everything. And then it just came to this idea of like allowing us to have an experimental, kind of an experimental line. So we'll be doing there'll be a new artist series, like a new black label. So I guess I'll get my plug in now though. If you join Breeze and you text 926-848, you become a member of our, Pinhook text to buy thing. That's where a lot of these special things are available.
Is that what Jordan has? Oh, you sneaky little.
Oh yeah.
Secrets out. Secrets out.
If you have that, you know about the library series. I mean, you know about things you don't even know about.
I got to step up my game, or I just got to follow what Jordan's doing. Sean, one of the things that I thought was really of many that I thought was really wonderful about our first VT is you shared with us what a pinhook is.
Sure.
So if you could just, because that's,
I'm glad,
and everything else.
I'm so glad you honestly reminded me of that, because it's probably the thing I'm at worst at, because I get so into like the geeky part that I always forget it, which this part is really fun too. But so, as I mentioned in the beginning, vintages were the original idea, but there was no idea of like, how do you communicate this story? And then, as I mentioned, we had bought our barrels from MGP, and actually at the time you couldn't visit MGP. Now that's changed, but you couldn't visit MGP, you couldn't touch your barrels. And so part of the whole fun is like, well, we got to touch our barrels and taste them and have an excuse to visit them. And like, why else would you buy bourbon barrels if not to like be able to tell your significant other that you had to, go check on the barrels. And of course we wanted to do that in Kentucky. And one of my founding partners, his best friend from high school, grew up in thoroughbred horse racing, a guy named Jamie Hill. And Jamie's dad was in fact at the track at the New York Racing Association. And so Jamie had not fallen in his father's footsteps in terms of being a vet, but in terms of being in thoroughbred horse racing. So whenever we'd go to Kentucky, which was like 4 or 5, 6 times a year, we'd stay at Jamie's house. And Jamie just, it might be a cliche, but other than bourbon, there's not really much to do besides horses in Kentucky. And so Jamie would take us to Keeneland during the racing season or Churchill Downs. We'd go to watch horses train. We'd check out horse farms. We'd go to horse sales. And we're just kind of like soaking it all in with no particular, goal in mind. And then Jamie was explaining to us this big part of his business, which is called pinhooking. And a pinhook in thoroughbred horse racing is when you buy a baby thoroughbred based on its lineage with the explicit intent of selling it for a profit when it's mature. So you're buying a racehorse to sell it to someone else so that they can race the horse, but you're betting that your knowledge of the horse's lineage and your eye for how the horse looks physically when it's young will allow you to sell it for more than you paid for it. And so it's just a flip, it's a buy to sell. And at that time, particularly in the bourbon industry, there was a lack of transparency, which always drove me crazy. Like, people would pretend they had a distillery when they didn't. It was all very misleading. And we just, as a reaction to that, wanted to make it very clear that we buy bourbon. We don't have a distillery. And we buy the best barrels we can, and we mature them and we sell them. And so we connected the dots that we were pinhooking bourbon, buying baby bourbon based on its lineage, hoping it matured into a thoroughbred whiskey, blending it, and then selling it. Jamie also has a racing stable called Bourbon Lane Stable, and every horse in his stable has bourbon in the name of the horse, and rye as well. And so then we really just connected all the dots, and we said to Jamie, what if every vintage, in order to reinforce the idea that it's unique, is connected to an active racing horse in your stable that's an up and coming thoroughbred, not a proven thoroughbred. So it's not a commemorative bottle. It's a horse that hasn't, maybe they've raced once, maybe they haven't raced at all. And that's how this idea came of putting, so Bourbon Heist is a 2-year-old horse that Jamie thinks has a decent shot at being a Derby horse next year.
So I see an opportunity, to make some money. It's like we could actually go. visit Bourbon Heist with a bottle of Bourbon Heist and have a picture taken. That would be incredible.
100%. 100%. Yeah, and I think to your point, that was really that idea too, was like that these can be experiential. I mean, I think most people probably just enjoy them in their homes and they don't take it much further, and they probably don't even know that the horses are real. But there have been days, I know for a fact, where one of our horses, or not, we don't own the horses, but one of Jamie's horses, or a Bourbon Lane horse, was racing at Keeneland or Churchill Downs. Both racetracks carry Pinhook. At the time, they were carrying the bottle that had that horse that was racing on the bottle. And you could have bet on that horse and won money because that horse won the race. And that was this idea
Now,
of
I am
like
very
bringing
happy
it all
with
together.
that. Thank you for sharing that. That makes me really, really happy.
Which whiskey are we finishing with?
We're on the Tis Rye Time 5.
The 5. Okay.
Yeah, so then Bourbon War 5 is gonna be next. So
Okay, great.
is Tis Rye Time gonna continue through the whole vertical series, or are you gonna change
Yeah.
it? Okay, it's good.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I think while it's confusing, the decision we made with the vertical was kind of like you're following the same barrels, so that horse doesn't change. So the vertical Bourbon War is always the vertical bourbon horse, and Tis Rye Time is always the vertical rye horse. But then we're missing one, but really what I consider our core product, which is all our Castle and Key straight bourbon, high proof bourbon, straight rye, and then a high proof rye, which is a teal wax, which is coming out in October.
Mhm.
That to me is kind of like, that's our core product. That's our Kentucky product. Everything else we do, it's reaching the point. I actually think, and David, because he's got a particularly good memory, might be able to remember if I'm being accurate here, but I'm pretty sure, because I try not to be overconfident, but I was pretty confident saying, hey, you got to look out for this vertical series, because forget about whatever you think about it. It's just the nature of the bourbon business. If you've got a collectible series and you got to have all 9, and the age statements are going to keep going up, and then more and more people are going to hear about it. Well, I think since then, there was an article in Food and Wine that called the vertical series the next Pappy Van Winkle. They didn't call Pinhook the next Pappy Van Winkle, but they said the vertical series is the next Pappy Van Winkle. And then there was recently an article in Vine Pair that was saying, okay, we already know what the current unicorns are. What are the future unicorns? And I think there were only 5 whiskeys in the mix. One of them was like the Maker's Mark, whatever. What is it? The RC 6. But it was kind of like trying to predict what these other ones were. And the vertical series was included in that one too. So I think the word is starting to get out, but I would also say that these are still affordable and attainable bottles. But when I remember this because when I was at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, someone was like, oh, I got to jump on the early ones. And they looked online, and the 4-year was $90, where it was a $45 retail bottle. So,
But if
you'd say, well, that's not.
If you're a chaser, as what we like to call them in here, as taters,
Yeah.
you're trying to kind of get your collection together. $90 is still very reasonable, because they're going to look at this thing as an investment if they want to do that. So your early expressions are still available online, or people can search them out?
You could definitely, I would say that person tried to find them on Breeze. Keep in mind too, right? Like we're not Breeze's reaching out to retailers to find the product. So that was the best price. I'm not saying you can't find 4-year cheaper than $90, but when they look for it on Breeze, which would be,
you'd have to.
But you could also just Google it and see what is available on Caskers, or all the usual stuff.
Yeah.
But my point to people would be, yeah, sure. If you want to chase them, if you're collecting it like Pokemon or baseball cards, or you're doing it because you think that the value is going to go up and you're going to make some money, I almost don't care what your perspective is, but I would say I'm a consumer of product. I'm not good at holding on to things. So I would more say, if the idea of tasting all 9 years in a row is interesting to you, then that would be the most compelling reason to do it. and
Sean,
do
that's,
it
I think, how
before.
you did it. I think this is very similar to how you kind of prefaced it and framed it back then when we first did this. It was, something that you have similar to Vadim. You do like a soft marketing approach. You don't hit people over the head by saying you better get these, whether you're going to drink them or not, you should try to chase these down and get them. I'm a big believer of you buy it, you drink it, you crack it, you share it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of the fun and exciting part about it. So yes, you did. I do remember you mentioning something like that. And I would advocate, yeah, the vertical series is really great. Pinhook is, fantastic. And like you just said, if for those of us here and for all of our friends, if you want to chase something, the vertical series would be a good thing to chase.
So that means
Don't chase,
pinhook.
don't chase it. I gave up my 4 and 5-year-olds rye for this tasting. I need replacements. So don't look for them anywhere in LA. They're not good.
I appreciate your sacrifice, Vadim.
So let's see. What do you guys have? Wait, I gotta grab my bottle.
I'm curious to hear what people think in the 4 versus the 5. I'm letting it open up.
So those of you who are, I think, as we heard, those of you who are on Breeze got this notification. So I actually have the 6 year, which is released early to our loyal followers, but we'll be hitting the shelves, where you guys are. Should be out in California, I would think, I don't know, in the next 2 weeks or so. So I actually drank all my 5 years, so I'm on the 6 year.
Well, I thought there was a big difference between 4 and 5. I think 5 definitely was a little bit more, I wouldn't say tighter.
Yeah.
It just seems a little bit more complex from the very front palate to mid palate. I think that the finish was also very nice and elegant, but it was just interesting the way that the beginning of it it was just like it hit and then it just went boom, and it had a lot of density to it, to the complexity of the flavors, if that makes any sense. But it was enjoyable. I think looking at the comments, a lot of people kind of like the 4 more because it had that like more of a smoothness or kind of easiness, softness. If I was reading those correctly. Vadim, you can help me.
I think the 4 resonated with people. It's very easy to drink and very floral. I remember when I picked up the 5, that's what I think I tried it at Jordan's house and I was blown away at how floral it was. But it's also one of those things where you got to let it open up. The higher the proof, in my experience, you got to let it open up or add a few drops of water to kind of, it's really not apples to apples to compare a 97 to a 103, right? You got to bring him to the same playing field. Yeah, they're both fantastic.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting one it's like, I think to your point, Vadim, maybe it's a hard side by side because there's something a little easier about the 4, but then it would be really interesting to try the 5, completely separate and see what you think of it. But I was really happy with how the 5 turned out. I love that one. It's like it kind of reminds me of like a gingerbread cookie.
No, I love the 5. I really wish I had a small format ice cube to drink it on. Try it.
And that's the thing that's so cool about what you guys do is just that one little year difference between these two. And obviously we know you're not making the same thing over and over, but they are very different. They're both great, but they are very different whiskeys, even though they're really only 1 year apart.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a testament too, right? It's not just a year of age, but it's also just like, yes, they were all filled around the same time. And yes, they're aging in the same place. And yes, they're a year older, but they're also not the same barrels. I don't know who's been part of a barrel pick, but I think the one thing that I remember being the most kind of revealing that I didn't understand about bourbon in terms of the way it was explained to me was when I owned my bourbon bars and I was just listening to the folks from the distillery, they would simply just talk about the microclimates in a rick house, right? And so they would say, the center of the rick house on the lowest floor is the coolest, and outer edges of the top floor are the hottest. And basically it's just talking about different speeds of aging based on rickhouse position. But the thing that really threw me for a loop when I experienced it firsthand, which maybe some of y'all have as well, is 5 barrels filled on the same day, all aging next to each other, tasting dramatically different from each other, which makes perfect sense because one barrel is made from one tree. They can only use, kind of like the heart of the trunk of a single tree. And as you can imagine, no 2 trees are identical in terms of the pores of the wood, the grain of the wood. There's so many factors. You have organic material aging inside organic material. And so when you go to blend the next group of barrels, it's more than just where they were aged and how old they are, but also just then it's totally different barrels. And so it just allows for so much variety.
To that point, you mentioned the whole pod approach for when you do, I guess, your flagship. What do you do with your vertical series, right? Because I remember, I think you mentioned last time that your lot is like in the thousands that you're holding for many years, right? So you're obviously not pulling different ages because they're all the same age every time. So like, how does that's super interesting to me. Like, are you tasting all 10,000 barrels? Because last time you mentioned you have like what 14,000 barrels or something.
It started as 1,350.
Oh, it's 1,400. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so everything's essentially the same age. They're broken up into, mostly aging in the same place. And so, we're really just grabbing the lots. So there's a randomness to it. But I think because we have the added opportunity to play around with more barrels than we need, as I mentioned, let's say at least 30% more, then somewhere in there is plenty of variety. So you don't really have to get into like, all right, let's go in and taste. Because I actually, and that's another good point that you brought up. In the beginning, we were tasting much more of the individual barrels, not just with the vertical series, but across the board. What occurred to me was that there was way too much randomness to make it worthwhile, right? If you think about then, well, ultimately, sure, you could say, what if I did same thing I described? You're doing 100 barrel blend, you pull 130 barrels. And what if phase 1 is like, all right, let me taste all 130 as single barrels and then try to intentionally build 10 barrel blends, as opposed to kind of assigning them randomly by age, as I was mentioning. But then think about the math, right? It's like, but then so many of those barrels are going to end up getting blended together anyway. So why did you spend so much time? And I think I would say the first time we tried it, I mean, maybe a shortcut is unfair, but I was just kind of like, is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, am I really getting anything out of it? And when we decided to take a more randomized approach to building the pods, I found that it had 0 impact. I don't think it was better or worse. I just think it was identical. And there was no advantage to doing. And then at one point, we went from tasting all of them to then saying, oh, well, let's taste half of them, because at least we have some, and then we can intentionally place half of them and then randomly place the other half. But then again, to what I was saying before, it's like, but then you mix them all together anyway. So like, it's not really getting you anywhere.
There's
So
also
that's where
the issue of too much choice, right?
that's the other problem. I really do think at some point, it's not even about like, I mean, from like having your palate oversaturated, that's not even really the issue. I mean, that can be solved by just like breaking it up over time. But at just some point, you could just be like, I spent 6 months tasting 10 barrels per day. And like, you're reaching this point where you're just like, you're going so deep that you're probably actually going to like lose the forest for the trees. You know, I think there's something to be said for just kind of, like I said, being a little more reactive like digging in, tasting quickly, and then as fast as you can getting to the point where like, all right, let's get to this blend. Like I've got the lay of the land. Like let's figure out a combo. And again, like I said, 10 out of 13, you still have 400 combos. Like if you can't figure it out, like 400 is plenty of options.
Yeah, and generally, the outliers right away. Like we've done a few barrel picks. There's always that one where you're like, okay, that was aged in a garbage barrel. That was not that one. Like, I don't know what the hell happened here. Throw those out. Throw that one out. Pick your top three, and then you do this. So you're essentially doing the same thing, just on a bigger scale.
Yeah, I think the only difference, though, like I said, the weird thing is, I'll have the equivalent of that in a pod.
Yeah,
and I weirdly need it to make a good blend, and I honestly can't even tell you why. And it's very different, right? The single barrel, it's a binary. It's just like I like it on its own or I don't like it on its own. The first thing I do, because it's the most natural thing, is I'm like, let's say I have 3 pods that I think are the most kind of astringent, hot, and if you're just like lacking in character, not having the longest finishes, being too sharp on the nose, seeming like they don't have good alcohol integration, where the alcohol seems like very sharp and noticeable. Well, that would make the most sense. Like throw those 3 aside and take the 10 that you thought had the best qualities. And then you put those 10 together and you're like, that's terrible. And then you're just like, all right, here we go. Like, and then you have to
just a little splash of Malort. That's all it needs.
probably would solve everything. But
David's
yeah, it's
favorite
interesting.
cast.
But then, but at that point it gets interesting, because then you're like, okay, well, I need to bring one of these back. Let me look at the notes that I took on those 3 and see which one I kind of thought had the better qualities. Let me pull that in. And what's my rationale for getting rid of one of the 10 that I had that I rated higher? Like, okay, well, this one I had like this. And I think those notes are just a way of organizing it and giving you some way of tracking it. But in the end, so it's not random, but you're just, again, like I said, you're just searching. You're just getting, like I said, I think 6 to 8, 10 tops is all you need. But, you would go as long as you needed to go until you came to something that was special.
How much of your year is spent? Like, how much of your time is spent picking? Are you just doing that all year round?
No, because, we do, aside from the single barrels, like we have the 2 special, we have the white label and the black label collaboration and artist series. Those are really small. And then everything else, there are 6 other products. The vertical rye and bourbon, our flagship bourbon and rye, and the high proof. And the only ones that I have to blend multiple times would be the flagship. Everything else is just one, this is one thing. Like this is 6-year vertical bourbon. So that would basically be, you call it a day or a day and a half, or done over 2 days. So if you kind of look at it like that, it's not that much. And part of that's because we're not a huge company. So the size of those blends, it's not like, you do 100, like this year, this was 120 barrels. So that's one blend and you're done. And I don't have to worry about this one for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, are you international?
No.
Please stay that way.
Yeah. I mean, we're in 27 states and, we've got our hands full. Just trying to keep up with, not the part we want to talk about. Not that it's not fun, but just trying to manage the distributors that sell your product and all the stores that carry your product and you can imagine all the interactions that come out of that, and trying to take care of everybody.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but
and make everyone happy.
Exciting. I moved on to the bourbon and am very happy, as I have several bottles of this already in my collection.
We're on the 5-year.
We were supposed to have the 6-year, but it didn't make it to us in time.
Oh no.
Well, remember when you and I put this date on the calendar, we had specifically put end of September because the 6-year was supposed to be in market. And then nothing ever comes in market when it's supposed to.
I think, I mean, I think the supply chain stuff, as everyone's tired of hearing about, is affecting every industry, and shipping costs and blah, 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 like it's
Yeah, down to paper shortages from what I'm hearing. Like it's just stuff you would never think about. Like the cost of cardboard is up, and plastic.
Shipping labels.
Yeah. Thankfully, Sean hooked me up, and I have shipping labels for years. So if anybody needs shipping labels, I got plenty.
if but what I would say, since everyone's tasted the 5-year bourbon, is I think one thing I always remember from my wine days is everyone talks about having a good palate. I think that what's really important, and honestly, I don't know why some people have it better than others, is having a good palate memory, right? And so the palate memory would be, hopefully you guys can get your hands on the 6-year in a couple weeks, a few weeks, whatever it is. And let's say that when that moment comes, you don't have any 5-year. What you have, all you have is your memory of this to say, what do I think of this 6? Like, how is it developed? And so you really have to form something. And I mean, some people like to take notes. That's one way to do it, but like, I still think you have to form an impression that's really there, that you can, that sounds kind of abstract, but that you can refer to.
Do you remember, like when you're tasting things, right? You're tasting a million things. Are you a memory? Are you a write things down, or do you have digital notes, or like what do you do?
I do all memory.
All memory.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe I'm kidding myself, but at least I think I remember, which is the most important part. Like, I think that, like, if I taste a wine that I haven't tasted in 10 years, and maybe it's not that I'm tasting the same wine 10 years older, I'm tasting a wine from the same producer that's the current vintage, and in my head, I'm comparing it against the current vintage that I tasted 10 years ago. I still have in my mind, like, okay, Charles Jogwe makes Chinon in the Loire Valley, and I have this impression in my head of what those wines taste like. And now I'm tasting the current vintage of his wines, and I'm like, in my head, I'm kind of like, oh wow, these wines, they're really staying true. Like, or oh, this is more oak than I remember, or
It's
there's
so interesting.
something that you're connecting, and I honestly don't know. My hunch is, and I'm saying this, also saying I don't really know anything about it, is I don't know that being able to taste a lot of things, which is I think what people mean when you have a good palate, is like you have a sensitive palate, is the same as being able to have taste recall. I mean, maybe you could have like a more limited palate in terms of what you taste, but have really great recall.
Yeah. It's just interesting that you're able to taste and remember things subjectively, right? Because I taste things and I'm like, okay, I really like this, or I don't really like this for these reasons. But I also see from my palate that like what I really liked 5 years ago is not the same stuff that I really like today. So comparing a Glenlivet 12 5 years ago to a Glenlivet 12 today just wouldn't be a fair comparison, even if they are identical, even if it's the same bottle from the same case. Because my palate, I have grown, my palate has changed.
Sure.
So it's interesting that you're able to like differentiate that. It's impressive.
I think that I think a lot of it has to do with my sommelier training, because what they really try to beat in your head is the idea of deductive tasting, which is really based around the idea that your preference is not what this is about. In deductive tasting, it's not a, do I like this wine? It's like, what is the structure of this wine? The example I always think of would be something like, okay, I'm the sommelier at a restaurant in New York, and we have a 500 bottle list. My personal preference are old world wines, so like wines from France, Italy, Spain, Germany, right? But the clientele of the restaurant also likes California Cabernet Sauvignon, and they like Shiraz from Australia, and they like Malbec from Chile, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that to be a good sommelier, I have to give them selections that I want. So now I have to taste all these wines to pick the best wines for the list that aren't wines that I would personally drink or that I personally enjoy. But I still have to be able to taste those wines and assess their quality relative to price, which really has nothing to do with like, do I like them or not? It's just like, is this objectively a good wine? Which kind of goes back to where we started. How would I say, is that wine good? With wine, there's maybe, I wouldn't say more complexity, but acidity, tannin, also the aromatic complexity, like maybe some more elements. But ultimately this idea, it's like, is it hitting these different boxes? And then based on all of that, is this wine at $20 wholesale, which means $60 on the list? Is it a $60 bottle of wine in my mind? And do I think that someone who drinks it at that price will feel like they're getting something great? Which is all to say, none of that has anything to do with whether I actually would ever drink that wine a day in my life. But I'm still trying to pick a great wine. And so it's the idea that like, maybe in the end, like connoisseurship is actually separating your ability to assess quality from your own personal preference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's super deep. Yeah, for sure.
But that doesn't, but again, like I wouldn't say, and everyone should do that. It's basically when you work as a sommelier, or if you work as a beverage professional, it's just your job.
Mhm.
And so that's why they work really hard to like beat that into your head.
For sure. Thank you.
Going back to the 5-year, what I'll say, I remember last time, I think you had just finished blending this, and not to go spoil too much, I think it's been referenced a lot. A lot of us were really struck by how much better the rye tasted young than the bourbons, and how most of us preferred your rye stuff than your bourbon stuff. And I remember you saying, I get it, I agree, but just wait till you taste the 5-year. And I got to say the 5-year has, it lived up to the expectations you set, and I'm really looking forward to the 6.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I had to just make my way to another part of the house where I'm not disturbing anybody. Let's see, I don't know how good my light is going to be anymore, but here we are. Hey there. I'm still on. Am I keeping you up? Okay, we'll turn it off. Yeah, I would say wait till you taste the 6-year. And I don't think, but I do think, what I find interesting is I don't know where the tipping point is going to be, because historically the industry always favored 5 to 7 as the sweet spot, so I think it'll be interesting as the series progresses to see, is there a point? I'll be curious to see if there's agreement on you could see it going one where everyone just keeps going like, oh, well, of course the 7's better than the 6 and the 8's better than the 7, and that's the journey. But hopefully it's a little more interesting than that, or at least some people feel that way, but other people are like, I got to tell you, once it got past 8 years, 8 years, I'm just making this up, but 8 years represented this really beautiful balance of harmony. And at some point, no matter how hard Pinhook tried, the wood just becomes too much of a dominant note, and that detracts. Because I think that one thing, if we go back to where we started and everyone's great comments and notes, is there's a lot of those qualities that people describe, especially I'm thinking of the bourbon and how fresh and bright it was. You can't ever get that back, if that makes sense, right? You can say well, it tastes young, or I'm tasting more grain, or this or that, but there's some aspects of it that people enjoyed, and you have to give those up as the wood takes over more. You lose that. And that's not to say that, do I think the 6-year is better than the 4-year? Absolutely. A more complex, better balanced whiskey. Do I think the 5 is better than the 4? Absolutely. But the 4 also has qualities that I really enjoy that are will be absent in all the subsequent ones. And I think that's, for me at least, I'm hopeful that that's what people will appreciate about the journey, is it's not just as simple as like, well, we all know young whiskey isn't very good, and it needs it. Of course, it's all about 10, 11, 12.
Yeah, I think Jordan brought up a really good point. You were the first person to really kind of blatantly put it out there to say that if you're gonna drink a whiskey that's young, go for a rye. If
100%.
if you're gonna go a little older, then you can wait for the bourbon. But like at 4 years old, if you're gonna pick bourbon or rye, it's gonna be rye.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe and it'll get more interesting, especially Vadim, with your clear preferences to rye. It'll get interesting as it gets older, though, because I think probably the other thing that I said was, if it's Pinhook or even another brand, let's taste young bourbons and ryes. Let's say that they're all made equally well, then rye should win. Period. Because it tastes better when it's younger. It basically matures faster.
It's going to have a lot more complexity too, because I think
Correct.
the noses on
All
a
of the
young rye
above.
are just going to have that floral expression.
Yeah.
That we all, not all, but I really love.
But the other part I find fascinating, which I honestly haven't had enough experience with, and so I think I'm going to learn about this from this journey, is there's also an argument that rye has kind of like a dumb phase in the middle, that it just kind of not much happens. So it'll be interesting to see if it's like from this, let's say the vertical series from 4 to 8, it's like, sure, you can pick out differences, but there aren't these like huge leaps. Because if you think about it, the other argument is that rye, interestingly, drinks better younger than bourbon and older than bourbon. That eventually, that the structure of rye, like that, if I would argue that if you're like an enthusiast, you'd rather drink a 21-year-old rye than a 21-year-old bourbon. And you'd rather drink a 3-year-old rye than a 3-year-old bourbon. But what happens in the middle is a different question. Because
I was gonna say, I'm looking forward to us having this same discussion 6 years from now, and all of us judging you and being like, you picked all the honey barrels already. This bourbon's just straight oak. You already gave us all the good stuff. What is this crap we're drinking?
I mean,
we're going to hold you, but Vadim, that's a great idea. So Sean, yes, let's just make sure we plan that.
And annual tasting, I believe, if we can get down on it.
I have to say, I've done a lot of these. I remember you all very well, because it was, and obviously still is, it was just like a level of, and I think it was early-ish in the pandemic, if I recall, right? I mean, you said July, so it was like March, like it was all relatively new, and like the world of doing virtual everything was kind of blowing up, and I feel like I'd done a lot of them, and I've certainly done a lot since. But I just remember having this feeling of like, from your group, it was just a level of engagement and curiosity and great questions and great conversation. So it really stuck out to me. So, who knows what we're all doing, but I, for one, am not going anywhere. So I can commit to the idea that this should be an annual thing, and we can taste whatever the current vintages are, the other stuff, and we can revisit, check on the current vintage. I guess next year we'll have to get the timing right and make sure that next year we'll do 6 and 7.
Perfect.
Let's not forget that last July you promised that next time, which COVID's still going, we didn't predict that, but next time you would be hosting us in New Orleans. We talked about beignets for dessert, talked about some crawfish pies. I mean, I'm just saying. So it doesn't have to be every year, but one of these years.
At some point.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to pick. I don't know what it will be like when the 10-year comes out or something like that. That'll have to be the in-person version of it. But yeah, it'll be so fun, because I think obviously you guys have such great enthusiasm. I think not just for Pinhook, but for whiskey in general. And it really would be fun, because I feel like I'm always bouncing around if we can have a annual conversation with people like
Yeah,
who've been
I would
following
like
and say
that.
like, all right, what did we think of the 6-year rye? What did we think of the 6 and the 7-year bourbon? Like, where are we? Like, how's this journey going? And I
Yeah,
think that
one
would
of
be
the
a lot of
things
fun.
about Kentucky, Castle and Key, as I was getting ready for this virtual tasting, is I dove into their Facebook page. And so is my impression correct that Castle and Key is a pretty nice experience? You ventured out to Frankfort, Kentucky?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, and again, it's with a lot of bias, but I don't know if your background does it justice, but Colonel Taylor was intent on building basically a bourbon estate. And this was back in 1887 at a time where, and I think, I don't know, show of hands if you've been to bourbon country, but a lot of them look like factories, which they are. And that was certainly the case back then. And the crazy thing to me about Colonel Taylor was that his thought was, I'm going to promote Kentucky bourbon tourism in 1887. And so if you go to Castle and Key, what you'll see is a railway station that he humbly called Taylorton Station, which is where the trains pulled in with grain, but also with people. And so there are old pictures at Castle and Key of a Kentucky Derby party at the old Taylor distillery in 1910 or like whatever it was. Like he was into this idea of this place being like, and he had been traveling in Europe and he'd been to Scotland and he'd been to England and he'd seen the Bordeaux estates. And you might consider this kind of like a mishmash with like a Scottish seeming castle and British sunken gardens and all this type of stuff. But the bottom line is like he was trying to build this like bourbon estate, and there's really nothing like it in the world of, I mean, there are other, don't get me wrong, there are other beautiful distilleries, but what's behind you right now, David, is like that was the
It seems like a lagoon or something.
Yeah, so it's actually, we'll be able to almost like extrapolate this from the photo behind you, but it's kind of overlooked, but the most important ingredient in making whiskey and beer and sake is water. And so the reason Colonel Taylor picked this location is because it had 5 ground springs. So he was looking for a great water source. You can't make great whiskey without great water. And so he built a keyhole shaped well. I don't know if you can see that it's keyhole shaped. There's the long part and the circle right there, and built a peristyle over it and he was a bit of a like a P.T. Barnum figure, very promotional. And he wanted to reinforce this idea that the water was the key to his whiskey, hence this keyhole shaped well. So yeah, this thing is beautifully intact and just, kind of minor repairs, but the entire facility is very much what it always was. They didn't put any new buildings. They just repaired all the existing stuff.
How far away from Louisville is it?
It's about an hour from Louisville. It's much closer to Lexington. So it's like 25 minutes from Lexington. And look, I mean, either way, it's a short drive, but the nice thing about Lexington is that puts you close to Frankfort, which means, you can go to Buffalo Trace, you can go to LeBron and Graham where they make Woodford, you can go to Castle and Key and do that part. But, and Lexington is also a, smaller and super charming town.
So Sean, I want to thank you very much for being here. I think we're moving on to the high proof, and I have a lot of compliments to say about the 5. I'm impressed by on the nose, it's definitely a bourbon. On the palate, it's got a lot of those fruity characters that I was getting on the rise, and it might be because it's my 5th pour, but I was really blown away at how delicious that was. But before we lose a bunch of people, and I know you were being corralled on your end as well, I want to raise a glass and say thank you to you for spending the evening with us. I know you're ahead of us a couple hours, so thank you so much for being here.
That's my pleasure.
We still got one more taste to go, but everyone raise a glass, turn on your cameras, smile. Want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and most of all, Sean and Pinhook, thank you.
Yeah.
One of many to come. Cheers.
Yeah, but I'll enjoy this so this is back to Castle and Key. This is our second high proof bourbon that we released. It's a blend of 3 and 4-year-old barrels. I think it has maybe, if I remember, like 20% 4-year-old barrels. As I mentioned, even for the high proof stuff, we'll taste it at a number of proofs. It just so happened that the cask strength was the best proof for this. So it's 119.9 proof. So it's got a lot going on, but I love this one. And actually, I've definitely gotten a lot of comments. Like, there are a lot of people out there, this is their favorite Pinhook.
So if you were to blend in, like sneak in a barrel from MGP into your Castle and Key, that would no longer be a Kentucky straight bourbon. It would be a blended bourbon, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Like, they're all blended. A blended whiskey is actually weirdly, the terminology is kind of strange and doesn't really even line up with Scotch, right? Because a single malt Scotch is 100% malted barley from a single distillery. Blended Scotch is just a blend of both grains and also a blend from different distilleries. But an American whiskey, a blended whiskey, is a blend of bourbon or rye with neutral grain spirit, right? But if you blended Indiana whiskey with, let's say, Kentucky whiskey or Kentucky bourbon, let me see. The TTB laws are not my specialty. We have someone else who does that. But I think where you'd end up is you could call it a straight, you could still call it a straight bourbon whiskey, because straight implies that it's at least 2 years old and that you have at least one dominant grain. And then on the back, you would have to say like something like distilled in Indiana and distilled in Kentucky. And then maybe on the front, you might want to say something like a blend of straight whiskeys. But you could still call it straight bourbon whiskey. But I don't think you'd even have to say, I think you could just say, I think you could either just call it straight bourbon whiskey and then people would be able to figure it out by the back label. Or if you preferred, you could say a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys.
Yeah, because
But
I
yeah.
noticed on your flagships, it says a very small font on the back. On the front, it's Kentucky straight bourbon. On the back, I think the bourbon has a 3-year age statement, and the rye has a 2-year age statement, which
I mean,
obviously allows you to go as high as you want, but as low as 2.
Correct. And so, and there aren't actually any 2-year-old barrels in the rye. The youngest barrels are 2.5 years old, and only 20% of the blend is 2.5 years old, but they don't allow for like an aged more than 2.5 years. So you have to round down, and then 80% of that blend is 3 to 4-year-old barrels, with the heart of it being like 3 to 3.5-year-old. But the age statement is a little deceiving, saying age more than 2 years, because I know for myself, if I see that, I generally just think, oh, so it's all 2 years old. Like, that's where I go.
That's a
when I see
very big
that.
discussion in Scotland. There's a brand who did was it 97% 30-year-old and 3% 3-year-old, and put out a 3-year-old Scotch. Yeah, it's a thing.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
But I think, I hope that part of that discussion is people understanding that, like, I mean, age is something, but in the end, it's just like, is it a great whiskey? The other side of it, though, I would argue is like, if in a vacuum, you should be willing to pay for age and proof, right? Because age means not just complexity, but every year that they hold on to it, you lose volume. and you have insurance and you have storage costs. So that's what you're paying for. And when you're paying for proof, right, you're paying for the fact that the yields are lower. So I would say as the consumer, it's still a fair way to think about it. And one rule of thumb I've heard, which I like sharing with people because I didn't invent it, but it's at least something to consider, at least with American whiskey, that you should be willing to pay $10 a year. Right. So that like, and honestly, think about some of the bourbons you see out there. You should, so a 4-year would be 40 and a 5-year would be 50 and a 6-year would be 60. And it's like, yeah, by the time you have like a 12-year-old bourbon, that should maybe be the thing you'd be willing to pay $120 for. And it's a little bit by accident, but this year our 6-year vertical bourbon should be $60 on the shelf, give or take. So
Nice.
Sean, I have a quick question. Well, not quick, but you're a third of the way into the vertical series, and that sort of, I know that you're doing stuff, but it's sort of going, and you have, you know, you have your 4 staples, but you said to yourself, you're not going to just want to be the chef who makes your 4.
right.
So have you thought about what your next secondary project going to be? I mean, what you're going to do that's not, because I mean, I know that's in theory 9 years away, but I also know that bourbon takes years and years and years. So you got to think about it. So have you sort of thought about 27, 28, 29, 30, 2000, 27, 28, 29, 30, what your secondary, instead of vertical, or Pinhook's also doing this?
Yeah, I think so. One thing is the collaboration and the artist series, because both of those are an opportunity to kind of do whatever I want. We connect the horses to distillate, right? And so by removing the horses from the black label and the white label, that means there are no boundaries. So we don't need to put a horse on them. So we don't have to say, like, I don't know if you saw the collaboration, which was the white label, but there's no horse on it. If we had wanted to do a horse, it couldn't be the same horse that's on the vertical series because it's not the vertical series, and it couldn't be the same horse that's on the flagship or the high proof product because that's the Castle and Key distillate. And so we would have just had to be like, all right, we got to find a new horse, and that becomes logistically fraught. But anyway, the two things that interest me, like I think of the artist series as experimental, right? It's like, I mean, we haven't played around with any finishes, and that's not like high on my list because I think there's so much of it out there, and I don't really know at this point. I haven't really come across an idea where I'm like, oh, I wouldn't just say Pinhook should do toasted barrel just because everyone's doing toasted barrel. It would have to be something that like meant something or was interesting to me. What the collaboration represented, besides the obvious, which was collaborating with a good friend of mine who's a winemaker, was also what are the best distilleries out there that are the up and coming distilleries. So I've tasted a lot of cool whiskey from all across the country. You know, I don't know if anyone's like, there's good whiskey. They're making good whiskey in Minnesota. They're making good whiskey in Wisconsin. There's neat stuff out there. And so I want to keep finding cool stuff. And that's what the collaboration is like keep seeking out, you know, other distilleries and seeing if I can convince people. Like those Wyoming barrels, I bought those when they were 5-6 years old. And we held on to them until they were 10, 11 years old. And when we did that release, I think it was the oldest craft whiskey release that had ever been done. Like not craft blending, but like the oldest distillate that you've ever seen from a craft distillery. Because Wyoming hasn't been able to hold on to their barrels. So there's so much fun stuff we can do.
So George, what Sean is saying is there's a Pinhook single malt coming.
I would love to do that. Yeah, 100%. And also like definitely would do something like that. Like just keep working around those parameters. I also think that like, I think to me, we have something so unique in the vertical series. I'm pretty sure we own that like literally, you know, from like a trademarking standpoint. Like we're the first people to ever do it. We own the name. And I just can think of like, let me give you the most basic thing, even though I'm not working on it. My experience with the Wyoming whiskey is that wheated bourbon ages way differently than traditional mash bill bourbon. So again, just even saying like, well, how does wheated bourbon age over time? I know that doesn't sound like fancy or it's not a lot of bells and whistles, but like that would be interesting to me, because my experience of the Wyoming stuff was kind of like, it was going along, just solid, not really changing. And then it took like a wild turn, you know? So I think there's so many different permutations of doing the verticals and seeing how different mash bills or different distilleries, different distillate, like that I think is, I mean, this is only round one. So I think that those possibilities are pretty endless.
So Wyoming.
What about
I
wine
apologize.
finishes since you were a sommelier?
You know, I think that if I remember correctly, I think that was like an early kind of idea as we were, because the wine thing was first. I just have seen, I'm not saying, I mean, I think a lot of what we do is actually pretty traditional, but I feel like all the finishes are people trying to experiment. And there's so much of it out there. I don't think that we could even stand out in doing it. Is there?
I think you're cutting yourself a little short there. I mean, if you take the skills that you already possess and what you're already doing, and then if you brought in that old world wine knowledge for being a sommelier and played around with some finishes, I'm pretty sure you could come up with some stuff that would blow people's minds.
Maybe I appreciate that. Maybe you just inspired me. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's something, maybe the people who are just like, they don't really know wine and they're just like, oh, we'll slap it in this. Maybe there's a way to do like, I don't know, what are all the blending grapes of Bordeaux?
See,
You know?
that's what I'm talking about.
And then you
have that
finish
knowledge.
them. And then you finish them, and like all the blending grapes is you have Cabernet Sauvignon and you have Merlot and you have Cab Franc. I mean, those being, you have Petit Verdot, you have Malbec, and then you finish bourbons in the different Bordeaux blending grapes. And then you do a Bordeaux blend. There's a good idea. There's a good late night idea.
That
right
could be
there.
super awesome.
I think that'd be really,
Love
really
that.
great. I know that we're kind of getting to the end of the night. Benim's going to have a poll, but I do want to kind of ask if any of the our fellow participants want to have a question for Sean. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. It is very rare that you're going to have somebody with this depth of knowledge and perspective, so it doesn't matter. So feel free to jump in.
As y'all think of a question, I will say, Sean, I'd like to bin a bottle of the GSM blend. Thank you very much.
No, this has been really great. I am taken back to the very first one that we did, and just completely enamored just by the evening and kind of how you kind of take us through what you do. So I'm very hopeful that those of us here who weren't there for the first one are equally as kind of entertained and have gotten a lot out of it as I have and as I did. So thank you again for kind of taking us through what you're doing, showing us a little bit about the inside and sharing your knowledge about it.
It's my pleasure. You guys really do have a special group, and no, I don't say that to everyone. I really, it's the level of curiosity and the generosity of spirit, and it's just a great. You all are truly a terrific group. So I appreciate it, and I do have fond memories because I think I just have a distinct memory of you all being one of, it's just like you're doing the virtual thing. So having this feeling, wow, that was really fun. It was such a great group. I feel like I really connected as much as one can through Zoom or whatever. And similarly, it's wonderful to see everybody again. And of course, You are the best.
Thank you, Sean. Sean, we did a poll for the favorite of the night. Do you want to take a guess of what the favorite of this lineup was?
I mean, my gut was like the 4-year ride, Tis Ride Time, just because there was a lot. Seemed like there was a lot of. I saw the most of that in the chat, but
Okay. Yeah, I didn't get to vote, but the winner is.
yeah.
So the winner was 5-year ride time. So 32% or 6
Oh, wow.
votes went to the 5-year, and then 5 votes each for the Bourbon Heist High Proof and the 4-year, and then Bourbon War took the other 3. So I was blown away at how good the I sang all these praises for your rye, and then we get to the 5-year-old bourbon, and I'm blown away at how amazing it is. That's
I have to say, I love this. And first of all, I would agree with it. Like, I think that would be a pretty good, like, that's probably where I would go. And I'm not remotely offended that there were no votes for orange and green, because if there were, it's almost like I didn't do my job, because everything we tasted after does represent a step up in price, hopefully a step up in complexity and overall quality. So, and I'm really happy to see that there was a similar like enthusiasm for the high proof as well.
Yeah, it was delicious. Thank you very much for putting out fantastic products and for spending this evening with us. We really appreciate you. Really appreciate your time. And as we agreed, we look forward to seeing you next year, probably later.
100%. 100%.
Thanks,
Thank
Sean.
you, everybody. Have a great
Good
night.
night.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you, Sean.